Now, whether you call it a processor, the central processor, or the brains of the computer, what you need to know is that the modern CPU is absolutely loaded with features that you're going to need to know in order to be able to choose the right CPU. So let's take a look at some of these features and explain them a little more thoroughly so that you understand exactly what's going on when you help choose a CPU. Now, the modern processor is primarily measured by two very distinct features, and they are clock speed and cores. Now I want you to do something for me. I want you to take a breath. And now exhale. That was one task that you did in 1 second. Well, we actually measure the capability of these CPUs by how many tasks per second they actually can carry out. So we call that 1 cycle per second task a hertz. You might have heard of that before. We also deem them megahertz if they're millions of cycles per second, or in the case of modern CPUs, gigahertz, because just like we took that one breath in 1 second, a CPU can do billions of tasks like that per second. So most modern CPUs you're going to encounter are going to be measured in clock speeds of gigahertz. Now, the second feature you need to know about are CPU cores. And CPU cores, quite simply, is we've figured out how to put multiple processors on the same chip. So let's take a look at how cores actually affect newer CPUs. And let's go ahead and bring up our friend here, the box. And the box can be pretty much anything you want it to be. I'm going to label it CPU here, but you can think of the box as the stadium in your local town, or the fairgrounds, or the mall maybe, any place that's really busy and that sees a lot of traffic to and from. It'll work great for this. And I'm going to give it something to communicate here with probably the RAM. Just go ahead and draw a little RAM stick here, and there we go. Now, most CPUs are what's known as single core. So that means they have one CPU on that system chip, and thus they only have one lane where information can travel back and forth from. But think about it in the example of going to the fairgrounds or going to the stadium or whatever. If you only have one street to get there, that street's going to be backed up both ways, right? So instead, we enable in CPUs what's called multi-cores. And with multi-cores, we're actually able to give alternate lanes of information where data can flow to and from. And if we go from a single core and add one more core to that, we call that a dual core. So now effectively, our traffic, our data going to and from has two brand new lanes to go in. And then if we add another two, because remember, everything in computing is done in powers of two, if we add another two lanes of information there, we create what's called a quad core CPU. And now we have multiple lanes of information that's able to flow freely to and from. Now, it doesn't just end at quad core, folks. There are CPUs out there called Threadrippers that might have 30, 60 cores by the time you see this video. We don't know. All we know is that these CPUs are becoming more and more advanced, and the two things that you're going to see that continually to get exponentially increased are the clock speed and the cores. All right, so that's a normal CPU. But there are actually some other CPUs that we need to talk about. One of them you may be familiar with, you may not. Have you ever seen those little IoT devices like a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino or something like that? Well, inside of them, they have this very interesting chip called an ARM chip. ARM, and that stands for Advanced RISC Machine. Now, the cool thing about this chip is instead of like these CPUs where they handle very, very complex calculations every second, what we try to do with RISC chips is we try to cut back and make a more simplified instruction set that comes out. And this allows us with these ARM chips to actually have a much higher speed of processing and a much more reduced workload. Now, ARM chips are not just in those IoT devices. In fact, Apple just announced that in the new MacBook Pro and Air and Mac Mini, they're all going to use the ARM chip designs. So you're definitely going to see those in the future. And the third type of CPU that I'd like to talk about is an APU. Now APUs kind of, they find a little bit of a middle ground, sometimes useful, sometimes not, but an APU is quite simply a CPU that has graphics processing capabilities combined. We basically converge those two technologies to save space. Now, You're not going to be able to run modern high-end 3D games on these APUs, the things you probably want to play today. But if you're just doing a little bit of video watching, a little bit of streaming, a little bit of video editing, or playing some lower level games, those APUs will do you just fine. Now let's take a look at one of Mike's cool tools, CPU-Z. Now, if we take a look over here at CPU-Z, there is a plethora of information to take in, but I'm primarily interested in showing those features we're talking about here. So if we notice, we scroll down here a little bit, here's our name of our CPU. We can see it's an AMD Ryzen 7 2700X. We can actually see the project or code name that it was given, which is Pinnacle Ridge, sounds real cool. We can see the total amount of power draw that it has. We can also see the voltage, all sorts of cool things, like all the extra instructions, like, hey, this supports MMX, and hey, x86 and 64, which we're going to get into in future sections that actually are the difference between 32-bit and 64-bit support. So CPU-Z is actually a really cool tool. You can come in here and get a very high-level overview of every hardware component within your system, and especially your CPU. So CPU-Z is actually a really cool tool. And you can find out a plethora of things about a system that you're sitting down at. There's going to be a lot of times you're going to sit down at a computer and you're not going to know what the hardware is on it. Run CPU-Z. It's a quick, easy install, quick, easy download, and it will give you all the information possible about your CPU, motherboard, RAM, and more.